And thanks, PILA, for putting this conference together. I think it's incredibly timely for our sector of folks who work in community-based organizations and nonprofits to begin having a more explicit conversation about what role we play in society and what role in particular we're going to play today in this increasingly difficult times that we're living. The issue of moving social service nonprofits towards a more social change agenda has been something that has interested me since I began working in the nonprofit sector nearly 20 years ago in East Palo Alto, and really trying to put and get to the root causes of the issues that we face versus just putting a Band-Aid solution to them, to put it simply. And to do that, you have to engage the people that you work with and engage them in politics. And I think that's one of the key themes I wanted to talk a little bit about today is how do we move from supposedly being apolitical service providers to agents for social change, and to, in particular, changing the ills that we face on a day-to-day basis in terms of the type of services that we provide. And also, like the struggles within organizations to become social change. So you have the dynamic of how we're viewed outside, but also the dynamics of internally the culture and the politics of our organizations. So it's really important, depending on where your organization stands and how your organization is viewed, to understand what the politics of your organization are, to understand where your organization comes from, what were the ideas and the reasons it came into being, and where is it now, and where do you want to go? So those are all questions I think that are really critical for us to be asking ourselves. Many organizations came into being, and obviously then, well, let me just preface this by saying that the nonprofit sector is huge, right? We have nonprofits that are basically corporate nonprofits, Kaiser, big art institutions or environmental institutions. But I sense, and from what I view as the list of folks participating, is that we're basically talking about more community-based organizations and institutions that are rooted in the community that we're talking about, who you all are here today. And all of in that particular part of the nonprofit sector, we all have different origins, and some of them came out of movements. Lots of our organizations came out of movements, and others are more recent and came out of a specific need. But in any case, I think it's important to understand that our organizations all have a history, and it's important to ask ourselves what that history is and what the underlying roots of our organizations are. So, given that, if your organization began as a social change, social movement organization, and you do community-based organizing, you have members, you're at a place where others may want to go. How many, or if you're strictly a service provider, that's a whole other process to get your organization to become part of social movements and social change. So just as a show of hands, how many folks on one spectrum think that the organizations are pretty much social movement organizations? They organize, they actively participate in trying to change the root causes of the challenges that you face in your community. So just as how many folks think they're on the other side spectrum that mostly provide services and aren't necessarily addressing the root causes of the issues that you face? It's interesting, about 50-50. So that's pretty cool. So I think in terms of the process of beginning to enter into that dialogue, into that process, I think it's important to also feel like that's something that is understanding that change that you're seeking in your organization is coming from the top, or is it coming from the bottom, or from all aspects? And throughout the day, as you enter into the different panels, those are real important questions as you go back to your organization, go back to your community, to understand that if we're looking to have social change in our society, we also, and have justice in our society, that we also run our organizations that way as well. And that we look at our organizations as places where we practice the changes that we want outside of our organizations within our organizations. And I think that's a real critical piece that sometimes, in a lot of ways, in my experiences, when you begin to do that, you begin to also get pushback from management, from board of directors, and even from staff that doesn't want to do more than just do their services. So I think it's a very complex process. But ultimately, I wanted to talk a little bit also about what time of day it is today for the nonprofit sector and for community-based organizations. We're living in extraordinary times today. We're seeing extraordinary economic crisis that every day begins to impact us in many, many ways, whether we're 100% foundation funded or we're funded through city contracts, state contracts, or federal contracts. We're all beginning to be impacted by this economic crisis. And that economic crisis logically creates increasingly inequality, and the inequality particularly to the people that we work with on a day-to-day basis. But not only that, that we also need to begin to see ourselves as part of, not just as service providers or organizers, but also heavily impacted by the growing inequality and the injustices that we face today in terms of this economic crisis. And that ultimately we have to ask ourselves, what is our ultimate goal as people in the sector of work that we do? And I was kind of joking around when I was thinking about this, but I was saying, well, what's some of our ultimate goals? Well, we don't want to disappear. I mean, and that's like, we might have thought of that as something that, kind of far out there, but ultimately we don't want to disappear. And in the past, I'm sure all of you have had sort of the debates with some of your colleagues about why do we do? Are we just Band-Aids? What are we really after in terms of the work that we do with our service providers? But ultimately, when I say we don't want to disappear, we used to say that we want to work our way out of a job. How many people have said that before? Ultimately, we want to work our way out of the job. I don't think that's true. I think what we want to do is to ultimately do our jobs differently. That our goal is that we want to implement our goals of social justice and the reasons why we do the work that we do. And our organizations, we don't want to necessarily cease to exist because we want to work our way out of a job. On the contrary, we want to make sure that we provide housing for our community. We want to make sure that we provide health care for our community. We want to make sure we're providing counseling for our community. We want to make sure that we're providing the after-school programs and the sports care, but not in a deficit mode, but actually in providing those services to ultimately fulfill what I think is our goals as a sector, which is that the people that we work with have the opportunities and full opportunities to reach their full potential as human beings in all the work that we do. And to basically move away from the oppression and repression that our communities face on a day-to-day basis, that you all live every day, that we don't want to work our way out of the jobs. We just want to change our jobs. We want to change our organizations not to be a homeless shelter provider like the type of work that we do, but actually to provide permanent housing and dignified housing for everybody in our communities, and that they have that opportunity so that we ultimately do reach that goal of liberating our communities from the problems that they face and at the root causes that they face. And I think given the crisis that we're facing today, we must keep that really in mind as we move forward. And as we move forward as a sector as well, I think it's really important. I want to take the opportunity to really make us raise that consciousness about the work that we do, that it isn't about, and we shouldn't mistake moving into social change work, especially now that we're all fighting for budgets or against cutbacks, or we're fighting for and struggling and competing with each other for those few foundation dollars that are out there, but that we're actually a sector in the economy, particularly as we also begin to, I think what's going to happen in the next few years is similar to what happened in the early 70s, when lots of forces were in the social movement in the late 60s, early 70s, and forced the US government to basically begin to invest again in communities. And I think that moment is coming soon for us, but instead of fighting each other for those resources, we need to be organized and as a sector to say, this is how we want these resources to come into our community. I have to stop now.
Thank you.
Thank you.